The wedding was nothing short of spectacular. 200 guests, a 5-star venue, crystal chandeliers that reflected every flicker of candlelight, and a bride in a gown that must have cost more than most people's homes. But there was one seat in the front row, reserved for a very particular person, as a woman who once held everything in her life. The woman Ethan had once called his fiancée. That seat had Grace Miller's name written on it, not as a gesture of respect, not as a token of sentiment, but because Ethan wanted her there. He needed her there, or at least he thought he did. He wanted her to witness everything she had lost, to feel the sting of watching him marry someone new, someone younger, someone more glamorous. That was his plan. But life, as Grace would learn, often had plans of its own. It all began on a Tuesday morning when an envelope arrived at her modest apartment in London. White paper, embossed lettering, expensive enough that Grace could smell the faint trace of cologne Ethan had once used to make himself irresistible. She stared at it for a long moment, letting her mind drift through memories she had long tried to bury. Then she opened it. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Ethan Clarke and Olivia Bennett. Saturday, April 20th, the Grand Pavilion, London. Front row seat saved for you. Come see what a real wife looks like." Grace read the words 3 times. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She folded the invitation neatly and placed it on her kitchen counter before returning to the small breakfast she was preparing for her younger brother and sister, the 2 siblings she had promised herself she would protect at all costs. Life had been far from easy since she left Ethan, and the envelope was a reminder of everything that had once controlled her life. Grace was 32 years old. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom flat, worked as a seamstress from home, and spent her days rebuilding a life that had been shattered piece by piece. Her mornings began before the sun rose, and her nights ended long after the city had gone quiet. Sewing, designing, dreaming quietly in a small room filled with fabric, patterns, and the faint hum of her old sewing machine. Every stitch was a step toward freedom, every design a declaration that she would no longer be someone else's possession. She had once been married to Ethan Clarke, a man who wore charm like a mask and used it to control, belittle, and manipulate. He had promised her the world, but all he had built were walls around her and the illusion of a life that didn't exist. Ethan's empire was a carefully constructed mirage. He flaunted wealth, status, and taste, but beneath it all, he had nothing real. Grace had discovered that too late. By the time she had fled, she had no money, no plan, no safety net. Only the strength she had carried all her life and the small apartment she now called home. And yet, she had survived. 3 years had passed. Grace had worked, bled, and dreamed her way back to herself. She had rebuilt her confidence thread by thread, design by design, turning her skill into a budding fashion brand that whispered promise even when the world had told her she had nothing. But now that envelope threatened to pull her back into the past she had fought so hard to leave behind. The day Ethan's wedding arrived, Grace felt the familiar mix of dread and resolve. She dressed not to compete, not to impress, but to remind herself of who she had become. A gown of gold, shimmering subtly under the morning light, carefully tailored to show strength rather than vulnerability. Hair swept elegantly, makeup polished but not gaudy, she looked like herself, the Grace Ethan had never truly known. The Grand Pavilion was magnificent. Guests arrived in luxury cars, champagne flutes clinking, laughter echoing off marble walls. Ethan, in a perfectly tailored suit, looked every bit the part of the man who believed he had conquered life. Olivia, radiant and composed, moved down the aisle like someone who had rehearsed every step, every smile, every flutter of eyelashes. And yet, it was the empty seat in the front row that carried the tension. The one Ethan assumed would remain empty, until a black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided up to the entrance. 2 bodyguards emerged first, their movements precise, confident. Then a man stepped out. Tall, imposing, yet calm, with an air that suggested ownership not of things, but of himself. Behind him, Grace Miller followed, every step measured, every glance purposeful. And in that instant, the room collectively held its breath. Grace walked toward her seat. She was not the broken woman Ethan had imagined. She was the culmination of her struggle, her pain, and her perseverance. She smiled, not the bitter smile he expected, not the vengeful smile he imagined, but a serene, unshakable smile. She was Grace Miller, and she had returned on her own terms. Ethan's expression shifted through disbelief, confusion, and finally a silent horror. He recognized, perhaps too late, that the woman he had tried to destroy was now untouchable, unshakable, and unstoppable. But to truly understand the impact of this moment, one had to rewind the story back to where it all began. Grace met Ethan Clarke when she was 23, a bright-eyed girl, talented with her hands. Having just moved to London to pursue a life of her own, he was magnetic, confident, the kind of man who made you forget your own name when he smiled. He wore expensive suits, spoke with ease, and carried the kind of charm that disarmed even the most cautious. Grace, cautious by nature and hardened by the values instilled by her parents, resisted at first. But persistence and the subtle erosion of her boundaries led her into his orbit. They married after 8 months. A small ceremony with promises whispered in a courthouse. Ethan had assured her a grand celebration would come once his next deal closed. That celebration never came. Instead, she met the real Ethan. Subtle criticisms about her cooking, her work, her ambitions. Comments designed to belittle, diminish, and control. Slowly, cut by cut, her confidence eroded. By the time she had escaped, carrying only a diaper bag and her dignity, Grace had been a prisoner in a gilded cage, isolated, controlled, and betrayed. Yet even in the darkest moments, she refused to let him define her worth. Her escape was messy, painful, but transformative. Sleeping in her small car, relying on the kindness of strangers, clawing her way back to independence, Grace began the work that would eventually allow her to enter the Grand Pavilion not as a victim, but as a victor. 3 years later, she had rebuilt her life, her brand, her confidence, and her soul. Michael Grant, the man who had quietly entered her life in a humble fabric shop, had recognized her worth before she fully understood it herself. He had been kind, patient, and unwavering, offering nothing but respect and genuine care. And Grace, slowly, allowed herself to trust again. Now, standing in the aisle of the Grand Pavilion, Grace Miller was the embodiment of every lesson learned, every tear shed, every night spent, working late into the darkness while the world slept. She was the woman Ethan never saw coming. Ethan's carefully constructed world began to crumble as whispers spread across the room. Guests recognized the significance of her presence, even if they didn't yet understand the full story. Grace sat, poised, dignified, and unshakable. The vows continued, but she was no longer part of the narrative he had tried to control. The wedding ended. Guests clapped politely, unaware of the true drama that had unfolded. Grace walked out with Michael Grant at her side, not in triumph for the sake of revenge, but because she had claimed her life back, her identity, and her joy. In the weeks that followed, the story went viral. Headlines splashed across every platform. Grace Miller shows up to ex's wedding and stuns the world. Seamstress becomes queen at former fiancé's celebration. The woman he tried to break walks in gold and power, and yet Grace barely noticed. She was too busy building her fashion brand, designing with freedom, sewing with love, and living a life she had chosen herself. She had learned the most important lesson of all. Your value is not defined by someone else's inability to see it. That people who try to break you are often the ones incapable of building anything themselves. Grace Miller had become everything Ethan had tried to deny her, not through revenge, not through anger, but through relentless self-belief, courage, and love. And that is the story of Grace Miller, a woman who walked through fire and came out gold. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need anger. She just needed the truth. And the truth was this: the woman he called worthless was priceless. The hands he mocked were the hands that built an empire. And the man he thought she could never find was standing right beside her. And that is the lesson of this tale. Your value doesn't decrease because someone fails to see it. That people who try to break you are always the ones who can't build anything themselves. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be and letting them watch. If this story moved your heart and you feel compelled, subscribe and hit that notification bell because every tale has a lesson and every lesson tells a story.